So some of the things in which I talked a little bit about micro-inequities, and they can show up and affect our recruitment and hiring decisions, and also can affect how we create job descriptions. And for example, there oftentimes are gender biases and the ways in which job descriptions are written and how they're interpreted. And there's a whole system set up for how to make sure that our job descriptions are welcoming, inclusive, and are able to reflect what the organization is seeking, and to seek to get the widest range of applications as possible, so that that diversity is reflected in who is sought after. And then through that process of recruitment, how the selection process occurs, type of open-ended questions that are asked, the ways in which the interviewing is done, who gets what, asked what types of questions, and again, being aware of how our biases can show up. Someone asked about the notion of a neutral question, and I think it's something oftentimes that we want to aspire to, is to ask questions that have some level of neutrality in them. Also recognizing that our assumptions about what is neutral may not be how it's experienced by the person on the receiving end. So creating questions that are appropriate, and being able to adjust those questions depending upon, so that they are welcoming, inclusive to people from different contexts as well. And here, for example, I'm talking about, say, I mentioned before, person with disabilities, making sure that the spaces that we have are accessible, physically accessible, but also the way in which we're doing our selection process is similarly inclusive. And interviewing, for example, eye contact is something that people will attribute certain kind of meaning to, but depending upon the cultural context, individuals, eye contact may or may not be demonstrated in ways that people assume to be the right way. And for some, eye contact is a sign of aggression or a sign of disrespect, depending upon the context. So again, these things are important. So expectations, how we interact with our fellow employees, again, something that remains very important. And how we do employee evaluations. So some of these, the ways in which the inequities can show up, for example, in employee evaluations, there may be, you may see a pattern of biases showing up in it. Here, for example, with faculty at universities, they've done research that have shown, for example, that women, particularly in the sciences and in other areas, are oftentimes rated lower than their male counterparts, despite similar content, similar skills, and so on and so forth. And that also is true. Someone talked about English as a second language. For persons for whom English is their second language, people will attribute a lack of knowledge or ability because their first language and their accent doesn't conform to the expectations of the majority culture. Policies and procedures. So here too, in benefits programs, having worked with the city of Vancouver, there are ways in which our programs were biased towards cisgender people, also towards heterosexual people. And so organizations seeking to be inclusive and not having biases that discriminate against one group and give preference to another need to be able to look at what are the practices that people are engaging in and the policies and procedures, and not just who's included, but who's not there. And so when, for example, investigations around inappropriate behavior happened, or discipline, terminations, discharges, and decisions, how are those things done in ways that are inclusive, are respectful, and so on. So if, for example, there's a pattern of who gets promoted and there's a pattern of who gets discharged, um, sometimes it will be because organizations are hearing things that they don't want to hear and are choosing not to take action. And so these are systems issues that are oftentimes showing up as seen as individual concerns because we don't aggregate the information. And we need to be able to capture information, analyze it, and analyze it in a way that tries to mitigate the biases that are oftentimes within them. And in having diverse teams to work on those things, that can be one of the ways in which organizations can reduce the systemic bias that operates, that we all have and all systems operate within.
Parker,
That's a short question.
Well, it's a thorough answer. And we had another question pop up on our QA board, and I wanted to read it out loud for you and our listeners. Would you agree that some bias may be positive? For example, someone with quote unquote street smarts, in brackets, which is typically based on their personal experience, is able to avoid or manage to get out of hazardous or risky situation.
Yeah, well, I think certainly survival skills are always important. Being able to discern when one is safe and when one is unsafe, and what are the options to responding to a threat are always important to have. One of the things that I would caution against, positive and negative bias, is that biases, again, oftentimes are based on prejudices, generalizations, stereotypes, that sort of thing. And they can help us, broadly speaking, and they can also misinform us. So we just need to be aware of when those things are occurring. I had an example shared with me at a training that I did a few weeks ago, where someone was, who was a woman of color, who was talking about being in an area in the States, I think it was maybe the Bay Area, what have you, and was sharing an observation where there were a group of men of color, I think Black men from what I recall, walking towards her and other female friends, and she realized that she was feeling uncomfortable. And there were a couple of things going on. One had to do with, these are men that are coming towards us, a group of men, don't know them, that sort of thing, on the sidewalk in public. May have been informed by some of her prior experiences, but she was saying these were informed by a certain assumption. She hadn't encountered many Black men before in the streets, so she didn't have a history of experiences, but she was, because of the sort of unconscious training that goes on, she was uncomfortable. And as they passed each other, they smiled and nodded, and she said things were fine. And she was just realizing that, wow, that's an assumption that I had there, and where did that come from? And so when you think about that on the larger context, for hiring decisions, those sorts of things, it can be problematic. So on the one hand, I do agree that survival skills are important. And sometimes, like for myself, I was living in Pennsylvania on the Mason-Dixon line, border of Maryland, and my car slid off the road and into a ditch in the snow. And I was in an area that was known to have a fair bit of white supremacist activity going on. And someone pulled up, young white guy in a pickup truck. And, it's late at night, in a ditch off the side of the road. And I was anxious. I'm like, I had stereotypes going on of white dude pickup truck, classist, racist, other sorts of things that were going on for me. And got out of the truck. He said, so looks like you're stuck. Can I give you a hand? So he pulled us out of the ditch and said thank you. Said he ran a garage, gave me his card, but I had a whole story going on around anxiety that was, it wasn't unjustified in some ways, but it also wasn't justified at the same time. And I was like, wow, thank you. And was really appreciative of the fact that that didn't go the way I thought it might go. So again, that was a series of assumptions that were not confirmed by my experience. So micro-inequities, want to speak about this. So constantly being interrupted. These are things often that happen to women as well. Being left out of discussions or projects. I know that many people can relate to this in terms of workplaces, or some people can. Trying to speak with someone who's busy texting or emailing or what have you, while you're in conversation with them, they're distracted. Can be dangerous if it ends up being things like distracted driving. So these are ways in which micro-inequities show up. Talking with someone while looking at their watch, talking to someone while the other person's looking at their watch, not being introduced and then being ignored in gatherings. I had my partner raise that with me recently. I was assuming that she knew the people we were around, and she's like, you need to introduce me to these people, even though I may have met them before. I don't necessarily remember who they are. And so I was like, right. So these are biases and assumptions that I'm making. And then as a result, not bringing her into the conversation. And so again, our practice is we need to be informed. On the one hand, that's courtesy, but on the other hand, it also can be a way of excluding folks if we don't do it.